listening to Second Chance Ministry Radio. The following presentation is entitled Wicked Women of the Bible, Part 2, Delilah. Enjoy and have a glorious day.
And thank you so much for joining us for this 6-week study of Wicked Women of the Bible. We're so excited to have you with us.
I am so delighted to be with you. Thank you, Lori.
Just by way of introduction, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, you know, I love the stories of Scripture, and years ago I wrote a book called Women of the Bible with Jean Siswerda, and we looked at 52 women of the Bible. We didn't have a lot of room to tell each woman's story, so I thought, wouldn't it be fun to drill down on some of these women whose stories are really fascinating, and they tell us a lot about what life was like in those times, and tell them in more depth and more detail. So that's kind of what got me started on this idea of looking at the Bible's most wicked women.
You know, it's interesting. We don't really necessarily think of God including in Holy Scripture stories that are truly of wicked people. Why do you think that He chose to do that?
Well, you know, God's dealing with reality, flesh and blood. And so we know today there's lots of people who, you know, live lives that don't reflect godly values, and sometimes I don't reflect life as I would like to with godly values. So the writers of the Scripture were trying to tell the history of their people as they knew it. One of the things that is so compelling to me about the Bible is that it doesn't whitewash its characters. Even some of its greatest heroes, it tells the truth. Mm-hmm. It tells the truth about King David, who actually murdered a man after sleeping with that man's wife. You know, this is not a holy book that just kind of puts up a one-dimensional view of the people who populate its pages. So God allows them because He wants us to learn about the history of His people, about how He works, and about the fact that we can always interact with the Scriptures in ways that are edifying, even if the stories themselves are not terribly edifying.
Mm-hmm. We're starting out with the delicious character of Delilah. And if we grew up in the church, in fact, even if we didn't, we probably know the story somewhat of Delilah and Samson. Can you tell us a little bit about her life and times?
Yeah, Delilah lived in an interesting period in Israel's history. Scholars don't know for sure, but they think that maybe she was not even an Israelite. She might have been a Philistine. And the Philistines, if you know anything about that period, were like Israel's arch enemies. This was a time before Israel had a monarchy, so there was no one government in Israel. There was no king. There were what you call judges, and these were sort of charismatic individuals who rose up in certain regions of the country to rule the country. So they're not, you know, don't picture anybody in a black robe who's trying to apply the law. It was a kind of a lawless time, in fact. So some of these characters, and Samson was, of course, Delilah's boyfriend. Samson was a judge, and he is a very interesting character in his own right. But she lived in this period of time when Israel was just beginning to form as a nation.
Now, Delilah's character, obviously she's extremely deceptive. What was it that made Samson pray to her?
Well, I guess Samson was, vulnerable to a pretty face, and she must have been gorgeous. She was probably very appealing. She's an interesting woman because in that day and age and throughout, that ancient culture, you wouldn't normally find a woman living on her own, and yet there's no mention in the Scripture of anybody else living in her household. So she appears to be an unattached woman. She doesn't have a father living there. She doesn't have brothers. She doesn't have a husband. So who exactly was she? Was she this Philistine woman? Was she kind of living on the shadow side of things and making her money by attracting a man like Samson, to be her provider? The Scripture doesn't really spell it out, but it could be that was the case, and maybe that's how she made her livelihood.
So it could have been her motivation was actually she was a woman who was all about money.
Well, it seems like that in the story, that she might have been all about power too, because here she is attracted to this very powerful man, because we know that Samson was probably the most powerful, physically powerful person we know of in the Scriptures. But it must have been that money superseded that attraction at some point, that the Philistine rulers actually came to her, and said, hey, we're having a terrible time with this guy. He's wrecking us. He's like a traveling avalanche. He's just coming against us all the time and creating all this chaos. What is the secret of his strength? And we'll pay you big bucks to find that out. What they offered her was an enormous sum of money in that time and age. So I think the attraction of, all that money, hey, I got all this money, I don't need to depend on anybody after this. Maybe it was security. Money for a lot of people feels like security. And I think especially for women that can be the case. And so we can imagine things we don't know for sure because the story doesn't spell it out.
You mentioned that this was a very lawless period in Israel's history. In Judges 21:25, it says, everyone did as they saw fit. That sounds an awful lot like today.
Yeah, I think, there are parallels for sure, that in our day and age, we talk a lot about diversity. And it's great that we have a diverse culture and a diverse society, and we need to accept and love other people who are unlike us. But we also have a sort of anything goes kind of culture. And I think that was true in that day and age. There was sort of an anything goes, and whoever's the most powerful person kind of rises up and takes matters into their own hands. And even, Delilah, living as she was. And Samson is pretty much, a case in point of he did what was right in his own eyes. And you read the story and you go, wow, he was supposed to be a hero? But he did all these crazy things and, some very immoral things, what we would consider immoral things.
I always end up feeling a little bit sorry for Samson in the story, but he wasn't exactly living the life that God had called him to either. Should all the blame fall on Delilah?
I think there's a tendency to make him the good guy. If you did grow up in the church, you might just remember Samson as this hero, and tragically his hair was cut, he lost his strength, and then he died in the way he died as a great hero, giving his life. But really, that's not the story. If you read it as an adult, you realize his character was very colored, and he wasn't exactly a paragon of virtue. I think sometimes in our history as a church, we tend to look very negatively at some of the female characters in Scripture. I think about Bathsheba, she was somebody, did she have an adulterous relationship, an affair with King David? Or was she actually raped? I mean, here she was a woman, she didn't have much power. He's the king. And then was her husband, we know her husband was murdered by David. So how have we looked at her in the past? Or we think about Mary Magdalene, and I think a lot of people grew up thinking she was a prostitute. She wasn't. Scripture doesn't say anything about that. What it paints her as is somebody who was mentally deranged. She had demons. She was demonized. So what about Delilah? I don't think there's anything very redemptive in her character that we can see in the story for sure. She's a dark character. She seems one of those characters that is pretty much, she's the bad girl. She's the wicked girlfriend. But, her boyfriend wasn't so great either, and he was kind of foolish in the way he put himself in her hands and in some of the things that he did. So I could see blame on both sides.
Thank you so much, Anne. This has been a great discussion about Delilah. We are so looking forward to continuing the study on wicked women of the Bible.
Thanks. I love these stories. Thanks for letting me tell some of them.
You are listening to Second Chance Ministry Radio.